the government had managed to lower the fiscal deficit target for 2023 while allocating an even larger budget compared to the one unveiled in October last year, due to two factors. Firstly, the economy has performed better than expected last year, clocking in 8.7% growth for 2022. This was above the government's forecast of 6.5% to 7%. This has resulted in an enlarged GDP base and has in fact lowered the deficit to 5.6% of GDP in 2022, compared to 5.8% estimated in October. As the government is maintaining the GDP growth projection at 4.5% for this year, it will also result in a lower fiscal deficit for 2023. Secondly, the stronger than expected economic growth had also allowed for a higher collection of government revenues last year. As a result, government revenue estimates for this year were also revised upwards by 6.9% from October's estimate, contributed mainly by the better collection of prosperity taxes for the assessment year of 2022 and is payable this year. And also there's an additional 5 billion ringgit dividend from Petronas, which brings the total Petronas dividends to 40 billion ringgit this year. While most of the measures were mostly retained from the initial budget table in October, there were a couple of new measures announced in February to broaden the government's revenue base. One of them is the luxury goods tax, which will be implemented starting this year on luxury goods such as watches and fashion items. Another measure is the capital gains tax for the disposal of unlisted shares by companies, but that will begin only in 2024. However, the government will hold consultation sessions with relevant parties to sort out the details of these new taxes. The government has floated the idea about introducing capital gains tax since 2018. With the tax measure now refined to only involve transactions of unlisted shares, it will represent a win-win for the government and capital markets. On one hand, the capital gains tax will generate a new source of revenue for the government and improve the transparency, as these transactions come into purview of the authorities. On the other hand, it can encourage growth startups and small and medium-sized companies to list on the stock exchange to avoid paying the capital gains tax. Yes, there was no mention of the much talked about targeted fuel subsidy scheme in the budget, as we think it's not really the right time to be introducing this measure, especially when the potential floating of retail fuel prices could risk exacerbating the current elevated inflation situation. Nevertheless, we are still not ruling out the possibility of the targeted fuel subsidy implementation at a later date, perhaps in the second half of 2023, when inflation is more stabilized and after the state election. The Prime Minister in his budget speech mentioned that the government has no plans to implement a wide-based consumption tax, such as GST. Given the current situation where the majority of the people is still struggling with low wages and food inflation exceeding 5%, therefore, it is not really a suitable time to introduce such a tax. That said, we still think that the GST implementation is still not out of the question in the coming years, as the government needs the GST to expand its revenue base if it is serious about reducing government debt. Budget 2023 has proposed lowering the income tax rate by 2 percentage points for the M40 group, with an annual income of 35,000 to 100,000 ringgit. This will result in an additional disposable income of 1,300 ringgit for about 2.4 million taxpayers. However, the government will partly offset this by raising the tax of the T20 group by 0.5 to 2 percentage points. This will affect 150,000 taxpayers. For the micro, small and medium enterprises, the government will also reduce the income tax rate on the first 150,000 ringgit of chargeable income from 17 to 15%, and providing assistance in the form of various loan facilities and guarantees, as well as grants and allocations to automate and digitalize their operation. The government expects the Malaysian economy to grow 4.5% for 2023, after registering 8.7% growth last year. Despite retaining its estimate between the 4 to 5% range, the latest growth forecast was revised slightly higher from the working number of 4.2% estimated previously in October. Economic growth for 2023 is expected to remain resilient, with domestic demand envisaged to drive growth amid a softening global environment. On the inflation front, the government has widened the range of its inflation forecast to 2.8 to 3.8% this year, compared to 2.8 to 3.3% previously. This comes amid a volatile exchange rate and commodity prices expected by the government. Overall, input costs are expected to moderate this year on account of stable global input costs. However, the inflation outlook is still heavily subjected to policy risks, such as the implementation of the target subsidy scheme.